Well, this is going to be quite a week in Washington. Everybody's got fingers crossed that it all goes off without a hitch and there are no scenes on Capitol Hill like those we witnessed recently. So what does it all mean when we get a new president for the Canada-US relationship? David MacNaughton was the Canadian ambassador to the US from March 2016 to August of 2019, there through all of the negotiation of the new NAFTA, et cetera. So many issues always on the table between the two countries. David has quite a history. North American president of Hill and Knowlton, he was credited with really changing the face of how public affairs and polling worked in Canada. And so he's got a real perspective on how issues not only are negotiated, but how they play and how much consideration is given to all of that. He sits on several boards and he's currently employed by Palantir Technologies. It's a software company that specializes in big data analytics. We could spend a whole day on what Twitter and Google and the guys are up to, but we'll maybe get to that later. David, welcome. It's so nice to see you. And it's been a long time.
It has been.
I've known David ambassador, sir. I should call you ambassador, shouldn't I?
No. David is just fine, thank you.
In the U.S., they keep the titles for life.
Well, it's funny that you should mention that. You know, when I was not used to all of this ambassador this and ambassador that, and all of this staff at the embassy used to say ambassador, ambassador. And I had a small group of staff that were my immediate staff. And at one point, I had them in my office and I said, look, I understand, that you want to call me ambassador when we're out in public. I think the office is important and you should do that. But, when we're here in the office and it's just us, it's David, right? And they said, yes, ambassador.
Exactly. You can't break that. But I found when I worked in New York that when our former leaders came, it was important for me to say Prime Minister Clark, Prime Minister Mulroney, right, whoever it was, Prime Minister, just because that's how they did it. And you have to respect the country that you're living and working in.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So a fellow by the name of Bartlett Brevner said, or observed at one point, Americans are benevolently ignorant about Canada, while Canadians are malevolently well-informed about the U.S. Do you think that's still true?
Absolutely. It's yes. Totally true. It is totally true. And it's one of those things that I found when I went to the U.S. and particularly when Trump had campaigned against NAFTA and said he was going to tear it up and all that kind of stuff. And, I think a lot of Canadians had the view that the way to get the Americans to be nice to us was really to kind of go down and say, we're your best friends and, we're your neighbors and you should just treat us nicely. And of course, that doesn't get you anywhere. And what you have to do is to actually have them understand that their prosperity, at least in part, depends on the trade and the goodwill and everything else with Canada, as does their security. And I think, then I think what you can also do is get American allies on side to advance your cause, because the ambassador to Canada's ambassador to the United States going in to talk to Senator Schumer, he couldn't care less about what I think. What he cares about is whether somebody from New York is going to talk to him about, this is pretty important because I sell a whole bunch of products to Canada. I mean, in fact, Chuck Schumer is a classic example. I mean, every time I saw him before I was able to sit down, he talked about our dairy policy and how awful it was, and so yeah, but they are ignorant of not just of Canada, but of the relationship and the importance of the relationship. Part of that is that we are far more dependent on their market than they are on ours. Right? I mean, that's just reality.
And I was there in the days post 9/11 and there was a Buy America only policy and we would the neighboring states and say, look, you have to understand that you buy, 82% of X, whatever it is, paper for your office, tires from your car, it doesn't matter, from us. So if you close that border, it's a problem for us, but it's a big problem for you.
Yeah.
If you make it about them, then you can start to have that conversation.
Yeah, for sure. It has to be. And it's like, as the risk I think we face at the present moment is assuming that because we have a new president who is very friendly to Canada, very, friendly to the prime minister, a good guy and all that kind of stuff, that somehow or other, all of the challenges that we had under Trump are going to go away. Well, they're not.
To witness the Keystone, the rumored decision on Keystone, which would be consistent with what he'd said. So that is obviously not in our interest. And it doesn't matter that they may be aligned on other policies.
No, and not at all. And I think the best argument, at least in the short term, would be to say, look, this you pledged to reach out to your allies before you did things. We're your closest ally. Let's at least have a conversation about this. Let's happy to talk about energy and the environment. And if you want to put KXL as part of the discussion, happy to do so. But let's have a sane conversation, between two countries. I remember just before the 2016 election, and I went to see then Senator Jeff Sessions. And, he said, well, y'all got to be real happy about the fact that Trump is going to let that Keystone thing go ahead. And I said, yeah, that's true. I said, our energy is, we have energy interdependence. And I said, Senator, that there are 32 pipelines that go south to north across the border into Canada. And he looked at me as if I had two heads and said, there are 32 pipelines that go south to north. Who knew that, right? And I think it's just, there's just a profound ignorance about the depth and the breadth of the relationship and its importance to key sectors of the U.S. economy.
This is what's so stunning. And proximity is no guarantee of understanding, right? It doesn't matter. We're each other's largest trading partners. And, you've raised there's always criticism of Canada too, because we have this sense of superiority that somehow we're better, we're nicer, we're kinder, we're gentler, we're all of those things. And we're at the same time that we're sort of saying, hello, pick us, look at us, care about us. We're also kind of saying to each other, but we're actually better. We have a very, very odd relationship with the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And you realize the number of family and friend relationships and everything. I mean, in my own case, my grandfather on my dad's side was an American. He was, and he came to Canada between 1914 and 1917 to fight with the Canadian troops overseas before the Americans got in the war. And there were 35,000 Americans who crossed the border to fight with the Canadian troops in the First World War. People, that's a fact very few people know. But quite apart from the fact that we have friends and family and everything else, there is quite a difference between Americans and Canadians. Mm-hmm. And I was struck in my time there, it struck me every day. I mean, and I don't know whether this is too trite, but I likened it to I said to the Americans, there's a big difference, and all you got to do is look at our Constitution. You say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we say peace, order, and good government. And you see it. You see it in our response to COVID and a whole bunch of other things. It's just a different approach to things.
Yeah, it really is. And it's not trite because it speaks to that. It when people look south of the border these days and say, why are they fighting about the freedom not to wear masks or the freedom to have their businesses open. That makes perfect sense to them. That's not some
no
science thing. It's just that business is important. That's the lifeblood, right? And we're much more into peace and order. Yeah, I found those things quite regularly. Now, we do kind of make the mistake, I guess, and you alluded to this, of personalizing our foreign policy, our relationship. That if you've got a liberal prime minister and a democratic president, everybody's going to love each other and get along, and vice versa, right? But it's not really true. I mean, it doesn't actually really matter if you like each other. You just have to get along.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, when I look back and over my, almost 4 years in Washington, I developed a really, really good relationship with a number of people in the administration. I mean, H.R. McMaster is, continues to be a really close friend of mine, to this day. Sonny Perdue, the Secretary of Agriculture, and I got along really well. And
policies. We'll come back to that.
and Bob Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, while he was tough and curmudgeon and all the rest of it, again, we've become quite good friends. And I know, Bill Morneau and Secretary Mnuchin ended up being really close friends. I mean, Mnuchin invited, Bill and Nancy to their wedding. So notwithstanding all of the theoretically the differences in philosophy and everything else, you find a way not only to get along because you have to, but also you end up realizing that people that are in public life, for the most part, are dedicated to public service. Now,
there for the right.
Yeah, there are exceptions, who end up being president, but what are you going to do with that?
Let's get into that a bit, because I remember having some conversations with you at the time, and you were regularly going to the White House, which isn't actually that common for a U.S. ambassador.
Yeah.
But you were invited over particularly to try and explain things, sometimes to the second level, sometimes to the top level, sometimes to Trump himself.
Yeah. Well, and again, I look back at how we ended up getting the NAFTA deal done, and one of the key reasons that it happened was because of the relationship with Jared Kushner. That he was very helpful when we got right down to the short strokes in terms of getting it over the finish line, because he's very transactional.
Right.
And we developed a good relationship. I mean, he had a good relationship with Katie Telford right from the outset, and then he and I got to know each other quite well. So yeah, I mean, and I met with Trump quite often. It wasn't regularly, but he was. Well, what you see is what you get, I think, is probably the best way to describe it.
But what was your sense when you walked into the room? I mean, in some senses, Donald Trump is what you see is what you get. I mean, he didn't misrepresent himself.
No, I think it's hard. I mean, as I've spent most of my career believing that relationships are important, and that you never know when somebody that you either have made an enemy of or made a friend of is going to come back. So you try to do the best you can to build relationships. Trump doesn't think about that at all. He's like, you're my friend today and tomorrow you're my enemy. So what? It's no big deal. But I think understanding the personality is really a key element in any negotiation. I remember when I first started working in the private sector, and I had a guy who, invested with me, and he said, one of the things you should always remember in a negotiation is people spend way too much time thinking about what their bottom line is and then they go right to where their bottom line is. And what you really need to think about is what's that person's bottom line, because then you can really get a successful negotiation. And I think that really helped me anyway think through what we were going to do with Trump and with the Americans in the negotiation, was to try to understand what it was that he needed,
Right.
To look like a hero out of this.
Exactly. And that is true in any negotiation.
Sure.
Discussion. You had, as you said, Lighthouser, who was, a guy who gets deals done. Like, that's his objective too, right?
Yeah.
But so did Trump stay away from it? I should call him the president. I shouldn't just say Trump. I mean, I don't like to be disrespectful because
of the office,
as the office there. But did he understand trade? I mean, he had said no NAFTA, and then he embraced it because he was allowed to think he had reinvented the wheel.
Yeah, I think he was never involved in the details of it. I mean, he had this fixation on dairy, which we sort of dangled in front of his face until the very end. And I think also, what we realized early on was that his principal focus, quite apart from dairy, was in Canada, was Mexico. And what we were able to do relatively early on in the negotiation was to position our ask, if you want to call it that, in the auto sector to be completely aligned with what they needed to. Right. And so it was really, how do you stop the migration of all of the jobs from, Michigan and Ontario and Pennsylvania and Ohio to Mexico. And we had, and it was really one of our public servants, actually, who was really clever about this, who came up with the idea about why don't we insist that a certain percentage of all of the of any automobile that is included under the NAFTA agreement comes from plants that pay their workers a minimum of $15 an hour. Well, all of a sudden we were on the same side as the Americans, and the Mexicans couldn't meet that hurdle at all. But it wasn't directly saying Canada and the U.S. gang up against Mexico. It was, we'll just put in a clause that actually helps both of us. And once we got over that, it kind of, the rest of it wasn't easy, but you kind of knew that we were headed in the right direction.
How did you assess, in retrospect now, the relationship? Lots of people benefited from Trump's actions on the economy. He was certainly more friendly to Canada on the energy front, and all, more open to that. Like, what is if we can set aside, all of the intense feelings there are about Donald Trump, particularly as he departs, what was good for us in that?
Well, I think there are a variety of things that were, I'm not sure whether I'd call them good for us, but there were important. I think his changes to the U.S. tax code were important because it helped stimulate the economy. I mean, the American, the main business taxes were too high, and I think it helped stimulate some investment in the U.S., which benefited us. I think, the reality is that the realization and the bringing forth of the China problem was something that I think we had been slow to come to the understanding of what had happened, basically, after 2012, where China was no longer, this kind of country,
or a third world country that needed our help.
No, they had become, a dictatorship and a communist one at that. So And I think the other thing is just, whether I think pressing people to step up to the plate on military and security. We need to do more of that, and whether or not we want to do that or not, we need to. And so I think there were some things that were helpful. I think there were a lot of things that were unhelpful, but I wouldn't say that everything was bad. And the reality is that, and I remember when he right after he took office, and I did an interview and said we welcome a renegotiation of NAFTA, and I was criticized, frequently, like, why would you agree to that? Well, my answer was, what do you want to do? Wait until he rips it up? Well, why wouldn't you engage? And by the way, it's a 23-year-old agreement, and there's lots of holes in it. And why wouldn't we want to renegotiate it? And I think if you look at it from the Canadian point of view, having the NAFTA renegotiation done and out of the way, I mean, I would not want to be negotiating the NAFTA agreement with the Democrats. I just wouldn't.
No, exactly. That is the kind of the confusion that people have. It goes back to that issue of, if they're of the same partisan stripe, then somehow it's all going to work. In fact, Democrats are traditionally not that great for Canada.
No.
So, I mean, how do you see that changing? I mean, you've raised a really interesting question with on the China front. We have been very, some would say hopelessly naive on this question. And that change is starting to come. We've got 2 guys that are being held hostage. Do you think President Biden is going to be able to help us with that? Is it totally irrelevant? Is he going to change dramatically from the Trump position on China?
I actually don't think so. I don't think there's going to be a big change. I think if there were, there were very, very few things that Democrats and Republicans could agree on, but China was one of them. And so I don't envisage the China policy changing very much at all. I think the challenge that we have faced and they faced and everything else is on the one hand, you hate what China is doing. On the other hand, if you're a canola farmer or you're a pork producer or you're a lobster fisherman or whatever, it's been a pretty good market. But I think I come back to the only way we're going to be able to deal with China effectively is if the Western nations work together, work in concert, and obviously the WTO and the WHO and all those kinds of things. I mean, we're either going to have to completely reform them, or we're going to have to do something totally different because it's just not working at all. So.
It's interesting you raise that because you made the point about NATO and the UN and Trump's insistence that people kind of pay up. If you want these things to operate, we're not going to just underwrite everything. He's pointed to some of these other things too, not just him, but he says out loud what a lot of people don't say out loud, but say privately, which is, this isn't working, right? Let's fix it. So is there an incentive now to use that opening that in some strange way he's created to allow the new government, the new party to take this on and say, we're starting from this point now, we're not going back?
Yeah, I think that the big issue, and I have fairly strong views on this, but the foundational question is, do you use the institutions that exist at the present moment and try to reform them? Or basically, do you say, to hell with those institutions, they're just not working, there's no point in reforming them? If you've got the Libyans in the human rights, of the United Nations, like, give me a break. And I think I would I think if you look at those institutions that have been built up since the Second World War that served us very well, are they are broken,
Right.
and I have real doubts as to whether they can be fixed. And so, for instance, when we were dealing with the Venezuela situation, we couldn't deal through the OAS because there were certain members of the OAS who just didn't want to deal with it, right? Mexico in particular. And so we did the Lima Group, which was sort of a coalition of the willing. So we had, Colombia and Ecuador and Peru and everything, and Canada working together on this. And I think you're going to find that there will be more of that kind of thing happening. But on the confronting China, the Chinese will try to divide and conquer. I mean, they've already done it in terms of their deal with the EU, and so we're gonna have to figure our way through that. It's not going to be easy.
Well, that's the thing. This is kind of a brand new rule. I mean, the Americans are being challenged seriously for the first time as the single only superpower in the world.
Right.
And the Chinese hold a lot of their debt anyway, so that could change pretty quickly. So it is a new world. Do you think? I don't know. And I'm asking you now for your thoughts on the new president. He is very old school. He's been around for a very long time. He's the guy that can go behind the curtain and say, "Come on, man, let's get something done here." Is that how it's going to work, though? Is that the skill set we need now?
Yeah, I think it could be. I think that the problem that he's got, quite apart from everything else, is within his own party.
Right.
Is that it's not a cohesive group, and you've got like even if you look at the current situation about the impeachment, I mean, I don't know. I guess there are arguments on both sides, but if it were me, I would rather not have that as a focus of any attention in my first 100 days. I'd be really interested in having people focus on what I'm doing, not what the other guy did before.
And I think that would be Biden's instinct.
That would totally be Biden's instinct. But you've got a whole bunch of people in the party who actually, part of it was living through the trauma of the attack on the Capitol, and I can't pretend to imagine what that must have been like, and therefore what the emotions are. But it's and this whole business about undoing everything that Trump did too. I think it's that isn't my view of reaching across the aisle, and I think the question is, can he? He's recruited some pretty skilled people, certainly on the international front. Blinken is certainly a competent person who's had tons of experience. There's a lot of people in the administration who are skilled. I guess the question really becomes, how does he manage the
left flank?
Yeah. And it's not easy. It's
no, I mean, that's a huge political problem, but there's also a very real problem in the United States. I mean, as much as you want to just say, okay, Trump was a one-off, and now that's over, and we're going to get back to the world as we knew it. 75 million people voted for him, and 8 million people voted for Joe Biden. Not all of those people are dressed up in fur, attacking the Capitol. There's an awful lot of people for whom he was a voice, and that's an actual real fact in American politics now, that whoever got the job has to manage.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, Donald Trump's presidency was almost I wouldn't say it was inevitable. It was inevitable that somebody like that was going to be president, given the underlying, tensions and everything else. And the Democrats weren't exactly, the friendliest bridge builders in the Obama years either. So, so I think the divisions that have gone on and the nastiness of the political discourse has been growing over time. And I think the most recent thing is really the lack of confidence that Americans have in their institutions, and whether it be the Supreme Court or whether it be the intelligence community or whatever. It's just, I mean, that is frightening.
And what do you do? I mean, when we're at this place in time, I mean, we're kind of lucky here. We just get to watch it, although the issues aren't totally unfamiliar to our political world too. The lack of trust in the political process, or even the court process, and the inequity that people see, however they come to that issue. Or I don't have a vote, or the CNN anchor saying, all his supporters go to Walmart and eat at the Olive Garden. Well, a lot of people do, because they don't have much choice. That's what they can afford.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's any easy answer for sure. I mean, I think it's trust is built over time, and then it can evaporate pretty damn quickly. I mean, we've seen it in other countries, and it doesn't take. It'll take some kind of prolonged poverty or inflation or whatever, and people lose confidence. I mean, I think one of the real dangers that we have at the present moment is that I don't, like, even if the COVID pandemic is over in May or June or whatever, is that the economic recovery is going to be very uneven. And there's an awful lot of devastation that has occurred that is simply not going to come back. And you've got the government. I think governments have done a good job of sustaining demand so that the economy didn't crash off the end of the earth. But when we get back to some kind of normalcy, they can't continue to do that, and the recovery will be extraordinarily uneven. And there will be people.
I mean, this, yes, of course, everybody in all of the countries, had to do something in the short term. You've got to save people, but the bills are going to be huge.
Yeah, for sure. And it's and I think the other thing that we have to be careful about as a country is, we are only 37 million people, and what you're going to find is that a lot of countries, the United States in particular, are going to look at the security and the resilience of their supply chains, and they're going to start bringing it home. And you can say, well, that's good because it's security of supply, but it's also protectionism, and it's expensive, and it can be very harmful to countries where you've got an integrated economy like ours with the United States, where there's $2.5 billion a day of trade that goes back and forth.
It's incredible. The other flip side of this is that America is amazingly resilient, whether it was 9/11, whether it's the angst that this president has caused. They've got that fundamental, I don't know, it comes from their constitution. I remember reading that John A. MacDonald said that our very first prime minister, going back and looking at the U.S. Constitution and saying that it was a skillful piece of work because it allows for things to be dealt with. There's a court process, and that somehow they have a resilience.
Yeah, there's no question. The other thing that I think you can that's happening is that the whole economy and every part of the economy is going through a transformation that we haven't seen since the Industrial Revolution. And it is, how do you use technology to improve productivity? I mean, all these kinds of things that are going on. And the Americans, intelligence, the quality of their universities, and all the rest of it. I mean, they're going to continue to produce really, really smart people who are going to, be able to keep ahead of the curve in terms of technology. I mean, think about, most of the countries in the world that just don't have that cadre of smart people. And in Canada, I mean, we've got good universities too, but in order to be able to meet that challenge, we are having to and need to have immigration levels that will make sure that we can keep on top of that.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges both sides at this point. You had a great vantage point.
Yeah, it was it's funny. I used to get it up and go into the office in the morning, and I'd sit at that desk and look out, and you've seen that view,
Best view in Washington,
and pinch myself and say,
yeah.
I wonder whose desk I'm at right now. It's just it was a remarkable experience that I really will never forget, and it was an extraordinary privilege to be able to do that, particularly at the time when we were going through what we were going through. So it was really quite remarkable.
Well, one final old adage, they are our best friends, whether we like it or not, and we are their best friends, whether they know it or not.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
It just keeps coming back.
Well, and I think
progress.
We will go through all sorts of stresses and strains and name calling and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, at the end of the day, we'll figure it out, and I think they. We'll see what happens over the next several months, but it isn't going to be a cakewalk for sure. I mean, it's going to be tough, and anybody who's kind of sitting back saying, "Oh, thank goodness, we got these guys now." Well, as I said, Chuck Schumer used to bug me about dairy every time I saw him, and Ron Wyden, who's another senior senator, all used to bug me about softwood lumber, and the governor of Maine used to talk to me about blueberries from New Brunswick, for God's sake. I mean, I don't know what.
It was a big issue, believe me. We dealt with that one too, even in the wake of 9/11. Those are the issues that are there. David, it's just great to catch up and talk, but to also to get your insight, because looking at your own country from that vantage point changes you and changes your perspective, and it's a really valuable one. So.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's good to talk to you again. And
we'll see you soon when we can.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, David MacNaughton, our former ambassador to Washington, with his thoughts on the world that we're going to see change quite a bit this week. So, pleasure to have you, and that's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin.